transit proposal here, now there isn't. We have all this speculation, and we really can't proceed to zoning until you tell us what your perforated
So
line.
I think, I wouldn't, I can think of a famous one that was the Canderel proposal, I believe it was in Scarborough, by the old Sheraton Hotel, I forget. And
Kennedy and Shepherd area.
Kennedy and Shepherd, and it now has very large condominium development there. That was a OMB hearing that we lost, and we took the stand that that there was no transit in the offing, and that we were against the rezoning, and we lost.
Yeah.
So, we will continue to pursue that line of logic strenuously, and we will have to continue to pursue that. Eglinton looks more promising, of course, because we have transit opening in 2021. But I think you will see that issue only becoming more prominent, and maybe we'll be back at the OMB saying that we can't approve something, or that we have to stage gate the approval. We could approve the official plan,
Right.
but maybe not go to zoning until we have a better assurance that we have the transit facilities.
Right, okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Bradford?
Thanks very much. How does the city grow? With the steady hand of David Fitzpatrick. Thank you both very much for this. Sorry. One of the big headlines here, I think, is the first few slides, 140,000 units that the city's that has been approved but not yet built. Do we have any indication on why this might be the case?
Yeah, through the chair, we've looked into this issue multiple times because it continues to come up. And the reality, the answer is complex. There's not a single simple answer to it. Some of the applications have part of their planning approval, but there's other stages to come. In other cases, if they're waiting, they're at the permit application stage. And a lot of the units are under construction, like 60,000 of the 140,000 are under construction. So I just want to be clear about that number, the 140,000, and not misconstrue it as simply applications that are just sitting, waiting as supply. There are a few of those, yes, but it's not the majority. So they're essentially working their way through the system, but they're at various different stages within.
I would just add that many are applications where somebody has rezoned the property, but maybe not with the intent of building it. So they've created the land value through the rezoning, and they intend to pursue a sale, or they're sitting on it. I can remember some on one that at Dundas and Runnymede, of a mid-rise, 6 stories that we approved in 2005, and I always thought it was the greatest little proposal. And only recently have I noticed that the dirt has started to move on the site, and that's 14 years later. So properties changed hands, businesses come and go. We don't get into the, we don't always have the knowledge of what they're up to.
So there are different challenges, but that is the narrative we hear all the time is, we've got 140,000 approved, not yet built. Why aren't we seeing, is it a supply issue? Is it a demand issue? What is that, when we look at this number and the context that some of those are under construction, some people are sitting on them wanting the uplift in the value, and then we have legislation that comes forward from the province under the guise of this sort of stuff with Bill 108, that's problematic for us. This would suggest that the approvals on our end are not the issue.
That's correct. I don't believe they are.
Okay.
This demonstrates that zoning is not a panacea for our challenges that we have
Right.
in confronting housing in the city.
So the other thing that was, so the other thing, I think it's part of it, in my view. But the other piece that was interesting was that about a fifth of it now is, we're seeing that on our avenues, and mid-rise units, more mid-rise units. To me, that shows that we're kind of moving away from the sort of spiky development that we've seen in previous years and getting more of the mid-density, mid-rise growth, that livable building form that we'd like to see. Would you be able to give me a sense of how that percentage has changed over time and how we landed on more mid-rise development along our avenues?
the chair, the amount of mid-rise is increasing. We've got about 9,000 built mid-rise units, 10,000, close to 11,000 that are active, and then 12,000 that are under review. So that number is increasing gradually between those different stages.
Have you seen that increase over time? Like, is that versus the report last year? I don't know if you have that off the top.
Those stages help us show the increase, because as they move from the active to the under review, if there's a larger under review, it's reflective of a trend towards that. Is one way we can see where movement is. And when we run these numbers in the past years, I can't give you the exact number, but I do recall it has been gradually increasing over time.
And then last question, as we begin to shift our policy framework like we have today, expanding laneway permissions, would those new units be captured in the data that we have here? Would we see those new units captured in next year's data set?
So anything that requires a planning application would be captured, but laneway units that are being permitted through the new zoning bylaw are not going to show up if they're allowed as of right. Then you're not going to see it in there. We are separately tracking units being added through building permits, and we are tracking laneway units through that separate monitoring program. And we also are tracking planning applications in neighborhoods to see what kind of buildings are being added. So we are looking at it, but it's not necessarily will show up in this pipeline.
I know we
Thank you.
want to
That's-
keep
that's
it consistent
your
data
last-
year over year, but that might be a good thing to add. Thanks.
Any other questions? Seeing none,
Wait, I have some questions.
okay, Councillor Perks.
So if I'm reading this correctly, slide 2, 2014 to 2018, we completed more housing units in the city of Toronto than we ever have historically in the history of Toronto.
Well, since
In any
1989.
Any 5-year period.
Yeah.
Yeah?
That might be accurate. I mean, my understanding is that Toronto had a serious boom in the 30s, but,
Not on this scale,
maybe not on this scale.
because the population at the end of the 30s wasn't even this much, okay?
Through the
And-
chair, the population in the 1920s and 30s was actually very large and significant, and we've never seen the same average number of
Okay,
persons per
so
household.
since the 20s and 30s, this is the largest amount of population growth in any 5-year period in Toronto's history, right? 2014 to 18,
In respect of the data that we've been tracking, yes.
okay.
This is
Since the
not
20s and
population growth,
30s,
this is housing
the
completion.
period from 2009 to 2013 is the second largest.
Yes.
Yes, okay, all right. And so it's not just a matter of what's in our pipeline where we're setting records, it's what's actually been constructed where we're setting records. Okay. And we are going to hit our, at current rate, it'd be fair to say we would have actually built our 2040 goal sometime in this decade, unless there's some big collapse or something.
Through the chair, it depends on the actual pace of development. It's a combination of both the units and the pipeline that's in, people rather that are in those units.
Yeah.
Based on the pace of development, we'd likely achieve the 2041 forecast before 2041. The population, however, because the average number of persons per household is lower because we tend to be building smaller units, it will occur before 2041, but not quite as soon.
Not quite as soon. Okay. So there are a couple of pieces in that about the population. So one of the things that we are seeing, and I see this, I have an R zone inside my neighborhood. I'm seeing population decline in the R zone inside my neighborhood. Now, the thing I'm finding there is places that currently have 20 units are becoming 6 units. Is this,
Or one
and that's
big
having an effect on the population growth piece as well, right?
That and smaller household sizes, yes.
Smaller household sizes, and So in areas where it is not only the case that you can build multiplexes in an R zone, but it's actually already built, we are seeing some population decline, both because of losing units and because of smaller household sizes. Is that correct?
Through the chair, that's correct.
Okay, so simply saying that you can put multiplexes inside residential areas would get a whole lot of new population runs counter to the evidence of what we are observing happening in areas where it's already built with multiplexes.
I think as we've discussed many times, there are a lot of demand and supply factors at play. I think, what we're witnessing in an area like Parkdale is that the area is gentrifying, and people want more living space, the property values are going up, and people are being dehoused out of their traditional housing settings. That's a function of values, not land values, but the values of people wanting more living space, some people being able to afford it. And it's nothing to do with the zoning in that case.
What was that you just said?
I don't believe it has anything to do with the zoning.
Thank you.
I believe there are other areas, however, where, for example, on the avenues, where we put in place as-of-right zoning along St. Clair, for example, where the zoning can provide a certain amount of certainty of expectation for the community and for the investors who are developing those sites, and it's beneficial in those cases. So that's why I kind of say it's not a panacea, it's not a magic bullet. In some cases, it may be more relevant than other cases, but it is not an automatic straight line between zoning and making housing happen.
So zoning would be a tool that we could use to give certainty in areas where which we have designated as growth areas,
Certainly, it's
like the avenues.
certainly it's worked on in avenues and in other areas where there's more of a direct connection between that zoning bylaw and a housing developer. I mean, we've had evidence of it just this year with laneway housing, where we put in place as of right, make it quick, easy, cheap for people to do it. But it's not just the zoning, it's the DC relief, it's the as of right process, it's a quick building permit review. So there's always many, many things at play that will bring somebody to a decision to create a housing unit.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, I do have some. So the growth plan forecasted it in 2001 that we would need almost 400,000 units by 2041, correct? And what was the forecast of the population by 2041?
Through the chair, the forecasted population would be 3.4 million people at 2041, according to the growth plan forecast.
3.4 million. And you're saying that in 2018, we've reached 91% of our forecast. That's what your report says. As a city's population was over 2.9, or 91% of the 2041 population.
Through the chair, yes, it's based on the range of the forecast starting from 2001.
Yes, so you've reached 91%. So, and how many properties have we completed? What's the percentage? So from 2001 to today, what's been our supply?
Through the chair, our potential supply of what we've built, in addition to what was existing before, is 242,000 units.
What's that as a percentage of what you forecasted?
Yeah, 61%.
So we have, as of 2018, we have 91% of the population that we forecasted, and we have 61% of the supply that we forecasted. Is that correct?
That is correct.
That's correct. So do all our departments actually use this forecast? So our water department, our transit department, do we use that forecast?
Through the chair, yes, this information is provided to all city divisions as a part of their background information for the development of their development charge background studies, their long-term infrastructure plans, and transit planning.
So my question is, so we have we are 61%, and we have another 140 that are under construction and so on. We have 91% of the population, so the population has grown a lot more than the supply that we have produced. And we have infrastructure being built for not even the housing that we are approving and being built, if they are following the growth plan. At what point are we going to bring these together? At what point are at least the infrastructure and the supply, are we going to try to reconcile some of these stuff?
Well, that is what we have been doing in Yonge and Eglinton and TO Core, is bringing them together and connecting them. So to project a certain amount of growth based in a secondary plan area, and to develop discrete infrastructure strategies and implement it through the 10-year capital plan, so that and pay for it through DCs. This is why we have a concern with the new community benefits charge in the new bill, because we banked on those DCs coming in with that projected growth over the next 10 years to pay for the infrastructure that's required for these people who are arriving.
So my question is, with this growth, and I know that, I mean, we as a city and planning and everything, we are dealing with an unprecedented number of applications in our planning department. Complex, a lot of numbers. We're producing, like Councillor Perks said, unprecedented number of units. But at the same time, we have an unprecedented pressure to actually catch up with being proactive on doing this analysis. Otherwise, it's not even that we're not building for the infrastructure, we're not even planning for the infrastructure to respond to this growth. Is that correct?
I'd say we're planning for it because we undertook the infrastructure strategies in TO Core and Yonge and Eglinton and
How
other.
about Toronto West?
And the other planning framework. So for the Galleria, for example, we've conditioned the approval on community center renewal, daycare, affordable housing, maybe not the best transit solution, and so on and so forth. Every time we look at a precinct or a secondary plan area, we have to turn our minds to the infrastructure strategy that's needed.
Do we need to speed and focus a bit more on the kind of work that we did in the TO Core and the TO Midtown?
Yes, and we had very similar discussion last year when the report came forward, and we on our work program that this committee sees every year, we have planning frameworks that we bring to you throughout the course of the year. Don Mills Crossing, reviews of North York Center. I mean, it's a long, long list where we're doing just what you suggest we should do.
Okay. And we also need to acknowledge that there is a growth of the population that is growing a lot faster than the supply that we're doing. I mean, our forecast is at 91 in population and 61 in supply. So there's clearly, the supply is not responding to the population growth at the same speed.
Through the chair, the supply is responding. We've got a tremendous number of units.
So if we built 61% to 91% of our forecast,
Through the chair, the 91% refers to the total population that exists in the city relative to the growth plan forecasts. The gap is smaller. The number of units we're referring to are the units required to achieve those 399,000 units that are required. So of those, we're at this, from 2001.
I'm sorry, but didn't the 399,000 units, didn't you come up with that number in order to respond to the population that would be 3.4 million? You came up, we said, in order to serve 3.4 million people by 2041, we need 399,000 new units. Is that correct?
Through the chair, that's the growth plan forecast, yes.
That's correct. So in order to serve 3.4 million people, you need 394 million. You now have 2.8 million people, and you only have 242,000 million. So you have 91% of your final number and 61% of your final number, no?
We needed 61% of the new ones needed, not the total housing in Toronto, using different denominators. So we're at 91%
Of the population growth.
compared to zero, not a growth, from zero to where we need to be.
Oh, I see. Oh, I see. So Okay, so 91%, okay, not the growth. So can you give me that number? That's the number I was looking for. So that I compare apples to apples. Can you give me that number? What was the growth supposed to be? So that we actually have that comparison.
Through the chair, I don't have those numbers immediately before me, but I can provide them.
That would be great. Be really interesting, because this argument, this keeps coming up, and, you know, you look at it, I asked you the question, and it's easy to come to that conclusion. So I think that it is important that we have that number. What was the forecast growth of the population, and what we needed in order to respond to that? Okay. Thank you. Speakers? Councillor Perks.
So where Councillor Bailao is going is where my head's been at for a while, which is that the City of Toronto is building at an unprecedented rate, an absolutely unprecedented rate. And any claim that either the cost of building in terms of fees and charges and taxes, or the regulations in terms of building, in terms of planning approvals, zonings, site plans, building permits, are obviously patently false. The rules that we have here are clearly allowing us to build faster than we have built at any time since 1920s and 30s, and we're outpacing the expectations, both in terms of residential and in terms of employment in the provincial growth plan. We are building faster than any other municipality you can name in North America. And just as an exercise, I sort of thought about it, and I thought, of any elected official in the last decade, the person who has voted yes for new housing most often is a City of Toronto councillor. Like, literally, the problem is not here. The problem, I think, lies elsewhere. I think the problem lies with things like the Condominium Act, which made it possible for investors to come in and finance the construction of very large numbers of units, take their profit, and be out. That didn't used to happen. Development didn't happen like that in the Greater Toronto Area until the mid-'80s, and it happened as subdivisions out around the periphery of Toronto. So the Condominium Act has created an incentive for money to flow into the Toronto real estate market, often from within Canada, but as well from the States and other places. Finance a development, either by being the financing for the land purchase, or the financing for the construction, or the developer taking their profit, so that we are seeing unprecedented amounts of money made off real estate that doesn't stay in the housing system. It leaves the housing system once those loans for purchase of land, construction, or the profit has been taken, and leaves the housing system altogether. So unlike any period in Toronto's history, we are generating cash off real estate that is leaving the housing system. That's why housing prices are going up. It is not because we're not building. It is not because of a constraint on supply. It is not because we're not keeping pace with demand. It is because we have one of the most financialized housing systems in the history of real estate in North America or Europe. Right now, we're living through it. We're living through a period of very low inflation and very high return on real estate, making this the most attractive place for rentier capitalists to invest their money in anywhere in the world, pretty much. And that's why we have an affordability problem, not because of our zoning bylaws, not because of the development charges that we charge. And I'm glad to see there's some evidence to show that we're building to keep up with demand.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Bradford.
Quick comment to thank staff again. Great report, always a good one. And I want to emphasize very valuable data here. And this information, as you can see, will be used to inform the debates and discussions we have on this committee and at council. It is remarkable, the level of unconstructed or under construction but approved development in the city. And again, there is that very persistent narrative that we were just talking about, supply shortage. You know, this definitely calls that into question. But I think you can see that Toronto's housing system, as a system, there are challenges, and we are not getting affordable units online for people. We have neighborhoods with populations that are declining, and the data is there to show that as well. And, you know, a 5-person household 20 years ago is now a 2-person household or a 1-person household. But for a variety of challenges, people those houses are sitting largely empty. People aren't moving in the housing market the way we would have anticipated. And there's still a lot of questions about whether we're building the right kind of supply. The move to mid-rise development that we're seeing in the numbers, I think that's a positive shift, but we have historically been very spiky, and we've seen that in the maps in previous years of where that development is concentrated. You know, growth has been directed to our centers, that's a positive, but largely because of Condominium Acts and the way projects are financed, we get the same type of development over and over. That said, I do think that looking at our OP policies and looking at our zoning bylaw is not the end of the world, and I think that there can be productive conversations that come out of that. We heard our chief planner offer comments where we have looked at zoning, as of right zoning on our avenues, where we have looked at zoning laneway housing options, and we've had success there. We've been building different types of housing, and that's a really important thing for us to do going forward. You know, the phrase is, it's not a panacea. It's not a panacea, but affordable housing is a bunch of different things across a bunch of different divisions, and all of it needs to be looked at in the aggregate. So there is an element of development charges when you're looking at doing 3-suite units. Like that is a factor for the carrying costs and the performer on those projects. Water connections, ingress, egress, all of these things need to be considered when we're looking at these projects that are at a much smaller scale. It is not an apples to apples comparison when you're looking at a 3-unit or a 6-unit project versus a 60-story high-rise. And by the way, they're not the same players. And there are people that are in these projects that are literally financing it based on the last small renovation or application that they did. So it's very different. The context matters. The part of the city matters. That also plays a lot of factor. And all of these things need to be considered. I don't think we should be writing anything off. I think we should be looking at all of the options, putting them on the table. And this information in the report is always a great place to start. So look forward to doing that work with all of you after the summer break. And thanks again for everyone's work on this.
Thank you. And to add just a bit of color on all this discussion, I just want to bring, I think, 2 important aspects to this conversation. One of them is really the infrastructure conversation. I think the more we go out and talk to our communities about development and bringing more development, and I have, for example, I represent a community that is very open to development, but they're starting to question some of this infrastructure. They're starting to see the pressure on some of our public spaces and some of the infrastructure. And we need to grow. We'll need to continue to build at this pace. And if we want our communities to welcome this and not to have development being an extremely divisive issue in our city, we need to make sure that we're producing the infrastructure and we're building the infrastructure. And I think that things like ensuring that the TO-Core, Midtown, that we push through that infrastructure, then we're planning and we give some certainty to our communities that we're having a holistic view, and it's about community building, and it's about welcoming the new neighbors that are going to be coming to our city and our neighborhoods and our communities, but it's also about, you know, making sure that we continue to have healthy and livable communities. I think it's really important. The other one that I think is, you know, there is this question, yes, about are we building enough supply and the population and so on, but there's also another lens that I think it's important to bring into this conversation about the zoning and the OP, which is equity. And when we talk about rooming houses, when we're talking about triplex, when we talk about secondary suites, more than also being about affordability is also about equity. We're also talking about what kind of city we actually want to build in here. Because in certain neighborhoods, when you're talking about homes that don't go for less than 1.5 million or 2 million, you are excluding a lot of people if you don't start having things like secondary suites, like laneway houses, or you're excluding people from living, close to their universities if you don't talk about rooming houses around York University or Scarborough Centre. These are the things that I think we need to start talking about, and when we talk about the missing middle and a lot of these things, we need to understand that this is also a matter of equity and what kind of city we're building. Because if we are continuously not being able to have the courage to speak about a lot of these issues, what we're doing is a lot of our workforce, a lot of the people that contributed a lot to this city, we're just pushing these people out because it'll be impossible to live, at least in many, many neighborhoods of this community. And I don't think we should just shut the door after we're able to buy a property into our neighborhood. We have to actually work as communities, as city, to evolve and to make sure that, families like many of ours and other ones are able to live close to their work and live close to the communities, and we have mixed communities and complete communities all across our city. So with that said, I think that I just need a motion to receive. Adopt. Okay, I'll move that. All those in favor? Thank you. And that's it. We're adjourned. Thank you, committee, for great work.